Have you ever felt like you always easily forget information, whether it's names or tasks that you're supposed to do? Or perhaps you write exams only to find that a week later you've forgotten every single thing that you crammed the night before. This is not sustainable because often we are required to relay this information, whether it's in the workspace to solve complex problems, or whether it's in a student context where you have to write final exams and there's simply not enough time to be able to read that information. We have to find ways to be able to retain information for longer periods of time so that we can be more efficient in our day to day activities. Hi everyone, Molweni. My name is Ukhandi Mshungane, learning strategist and chartered accountant. In today's video, we'll be talking about an important concept as to how do you improve your memory so that you can be more efficient, whether you're a student, in business, in the workspace, wherever you are. If you want to improve your memory, this is the right video for you. Now, before we actually go into the actual techniques and tricks that you can use in order to improve your memory, the first thing you need to understand is how your brain actually consolidates and retains information. Now, there's a three-step process that usually happens. The first of this process is the encoding phase. Now, in the encoding, your brain is exposed to information for the first time from your senses, such as sight, sound, and effectively what it does, it's similar to a librarian who is receiving a book for the first time. It scans that information. The same happens to your brain when you read a textbook or when the lecturer explains a concept that is new. Your brain is encoding it or scanning that information so that it's able to be recognizable within your brain. Once that information has been scanned or encoded, the next step is storage. Now, there are two main areas where the brain can store information. The first is what we call the hippocampus. The hippocampus is what we call the short-term memory. This is where we store the majority of our information. However, I have to caution you, the information that's stored there is stored only for a short period of time. Which area in your brain is what we call the cortex. The cortex is where we store your longer term information or memories, such as, for example, your childhood memories, traumatic experiences. Everything that is emotionally charged tends to be stored in your cortex. Now, the idea behind efficient memory retention is that you want to facilitate the transfer of information from your short-term memory to your long-term memory as much as possible if you want to retain information for longer periods of time. Once the information has been stored, the next step of the process is retrieval. Now, during the retrieval process, you basically try to understand or to scan your library of information or that has been stored in your brain in order to use those skills or use that information in order to apply to a specific context or principle. Think about this as being a librarian going into a library to a specific shelf in a specific section to try to retrieve a book that a client wants to read. The same is true to your brain. When you have to solve a problem that's complex in a workspace or you have to answer a question as a student, your brain will scan your library and look for information that is relevant that can assist you to solve that problem. Now, if you want to be efficient in the memory improvement and you want to ensure that you're able to memorize information for longer periods of time, you need to ensure that your brain efficiently encodes, stores, and is able to retrieve that information. Now, for you to be able to do this efficiently, you need to, number one, create the right environment for this process to take place. Now, when creating the right environment to improve the information that you actually restore, you need to firstly sleep. Now, sleep is an important tool because ultimately, when we sleep, what happens is that information is consolidated in what we call REM cycle, and this is the process that consolidates information that you've learned during the day, and it's transferred from your short-term memory to your long-term memory. Now, the opposite is true when you don't sleep. If you sleep deprived, studies on multiple occasions have shown that your cognitive abilities are significantly compromised and you are unable to retain information for longer periods of time. So, if we go back to our librarian example, it's like if the librarian did not sleep the previous day, he or she will come to work sluggish, and there's more likelihood that he will make mistakes, store books in the wrong places, forget and lose them. And the same happens to your brain. It's chaos that occurs within your brain if you don't sleep. So, what does this mean for you? If you want to be more efficient in memorizing information, invest in sleep so that you're able to retain that information for longer periods of time. Now, the second step is that you need to have a balanced nutrition diet that you actually implement in your way of living. Now, think about your brain as being a hungry organ. When you eat nutritious food, you're nourishing your brain. So, nutritious food is food that is high in omega 3 fatty acids or food that is rich in colorful antioxidants such as fruit and vegetables. Those type of foods are scientifically proven and demonstrably true that they can improve the functioning of your brain. So always try to eat a healthy meal. The opposite is true if you feed your body with sugary snacks or food that is highly processed. You will likely be sluggish. Your ability of your brain to retain information will be compromised. So if you want to invest in your ability to be able to memorize information for longer periods of time, you need to start eating a well balanced diet that can help you and aid you in order to be able to be more efficient in memorizing information. Now, once you've created the right environment for you to be able to memorize information, the next step of the process is that you then have to have specific techniques that can help you. One of the most important techniques that I implemented in my studies and in my academic journey that can also help you in any context is association and connection. Now, to understand why association and connection is such a powerful tool to memorize information, let's think about this basic construct. Let's say we've got Netflix and a stack of books. Which is easier to remember here? Hopefully, you said Netflix. Again, let me retell a story that will drive the point across. See, the other day, I was talking to a friend of mine, and unfortunately, he went through a traumatic experience where he was mugged and robbed of his belongings, his phone, his watch, and all of his valuables. When I asked him about that experience a week later, he was able to retell the story vividly. He could remember what the assailants were wearing, how he felt, what they said to him. Everything was so clear as if it happened that very same day. However, when I asked him, what did you eat for lunch that same day? He could not remember it. Now, what can we learn from this story? Our brains relate more to experiences than they do to routine tasks and information. Ever heard about that saying? We remember not what you said, but how you made us feel. So the same is true for your brain. Emotions are able to stimulate that part of your brain known as the amygdala. And the amygdala is responsible for processing emotions. Now, we know that childhood memories become vivid and they last longer in our brains. The same is true when you're able to stimulate this amygdala by simulating experiences. You are then able to ensure that that information is vivid and is longer lasting. So, what does this mean to you? If you want to be able to improve your memory and retain that information for longer periods of time, you need to create the necessary connections and associate that information that you're learning to experiences or events that you already know in order to invoke an emotional response within your brain so that you can remember that information for longer periods of time. For example, if I'm a student in the accounting space and I'm learning auditing and controls, instead of learning controls within the context of a multinational company, I can actually learn controls within the context of a business that I know, for example, a taxi business or maybe a small spaza shop. I'm more likely to relate with that information better when I relate it to an event that I already know as opposed to something that I've never seen before. So, what this means to you is that when you learn information, try to relate it to an experience or to a context that you already know so that you can make it easier for yourself to be able to draw the parallels and connections necessary to retain that information for longer periods of time. Now, the second most powerful tool that can help you in order to be able to improve your memory is spaced repetition. Now, the concept behind spaced repetition is that the more frequently you are exposed to that information, the stronger your memory becomes. So, the idea here is that when you're exposed to information for the first time, it's likely that your memory is going to be quite fragile. So there's a construct that we call the forgetting curve. And how this principle comes about is that when you get exposed to information for the first time, it will naturally go into your short-term memory, your hippocampus. However, we know that information is only stored there for a temporary or short period of time before it's then forgotten. This is what we call the forgetting curve. Now, what spaced repetition does is that prior or just before that information is forgotten by your brain, you then relay or expose yourself to that exact same information so that you're able to reinforce the synapses or the connections in order to facilitate that transfer of that information from your short-term memory to your long-term memory. So, what does this mean for you and how can you practically apply it? So, it means that if you want to be able to memorize information for longer periods of time, instead of cramming that information in one instance, try to read it regularly in a calm, efficient manner. So, read it once and then come back to it probably the next day and continually go back to that information and in such a way that it strengthens your memory. The more you go back to the information in regular intervals, the stronger your memory becomes in relation to that information. Another powerful tool that you can use that reinforces spaced repetition is doing questions under exam conditions. Now, the whole idea behind doing questions is that you're testing your knowledge to see that you've actually grasped that concept from that textbook or from that lecture. Now, when you attempt the question and you get something wrong, naturally you have to understand why you got it wrong. This will involve you going back to the textbook or to the information to ensure that you've understood the principle correctly. It's this back and forth between going back to the textbook, doing another question, and ideally progressively getting the questions to become more harder and harder and harder, and going back to the information that you were exposed to for the first time. That then is a process of spaced repetition, because now when you apply that information again after having learned it and understood why you got that information incorrect in doing the question, you are then able to strengthen your memory of that topic, and that's why you are able to retain that information for longer periods of time. This is a classic technique that I used to use. It's that process of doing this question that is the reason why I'm able to remember these concepts in a workspace to be able to solve the problems. Many professionals are able to learn information and retain it and develop skills through this process. So ultimately, you can also apply it if you want to improve your long term memory. Another way to apply spaced repetition is to use flashcards. Flashcards can be used for information that is difficult to remember, where you put it there and you continually refer to it, whether it's in your room or in your pocket, wherever you put your flashcard. That constant exposure to that information in regular intervals again strengthens your memory so that you're able to retain that information for longer periods of time. The next step technique that you can use in order to become more efficient is what we call mnemonic devices. Now, think about mnemonic devices as being shortcuts that your brain can use in order to actively store information and retrieve it in the future. Now, there are three types of mnemonic devices that you can use in order to boost your memory. The first is what we call acronyms. Now, acronyms are abbreviations that are a good way to be able to store and chunk information in manageable areas so that you're able to recall that information more easily. For example, let's study for an exam and you have to learn about Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, and Malcolm X. Now, instead of you having to memorize all these iconic figures, you can actually come up with an acronym or an abbreviation, MMM, and that NMM is an easier way to be able to retrieve that information and store it as opposed to memorizing the names. The second step that you can use in mnemonic devices is using alliterations and rhymes. Now, what alliterations and rhymes do is that you're able to help yourself to remember information, particularly in sequences. Now, for example, let's say you need to learn how the planets are structured in their order, for example, Mercury, Venus, Earth. Now, instead of you having to memorize that, you can actually remember that my very educated mother served us noodles, and the first letter of that alliterated phrase can actually help you to remember that information. My being Mercury, educated being Earth, Very being Venus, that's something that you can then use in order to retain information more efficiently. The third step, and more particularly if you studying a course or engaged in material that is abstract, for example, mathematics, you can then use visualization. Visualization is a tool that can be used to basically memorize information by creating stories that are relatable to you. And the stories don't necessarily have to be things that you've seen before. It can be as abstract and extreme as possible, so long as you can be able to remember that information. For example, let's say I have to remember to buy carrots when I go to the grocery store. Instead of me having to remember the word carrot, I can actually create a mental story of a giant carrot running down the supermarket and bumping different things. That visual story of having that carrot running down is more easy to remember as opposed to the fact that I need to memorize the word carrot. The same can be applied to your math problems. Instead of trying to memorize all those different concepts, try to create a mental picture or visualize it to make it easier for you to remember. Now, the last step that you can then use, certainly not the least most important step, is that you need to now engage in daily activities that facilitate or improve your ability to be able to retain information for longer periods of time. Now, some of the daily activities that you can engage in is number one, exercise. What happens is that when you exercise, it facilitates the transportation of essential nutrients and oxygen to your brain, right? The more you exercise or the more regularly you engage in physical activity, the more efficient your body is able to pump that blood that has essential nutrients and oxygen to your brain. And the ultimate goal of this is that your brain is well nourished and is able to operate efficiently, right? I used to see this in my day to day activities where I saw one of the best years of my academic journey where I was performing optimally was when I was exercising on a regular basis. I found that by exercising on a regular basis, I was able to be active and to retain information easier, and I was more energetic when I came back, which made the process of me learning more efficient. So, if you want to be able to improve your memory, engage in physical activity and ensure that you exercise regularly. The second thing that you can do is engage in activities that stimulate your brain to be able to be problem solving. Activities that do this, example like puzzles, word cross, all of these can stimulate your brain to solve complex issues so that you can be able to memorize information more efficiently. The these do is that they encourage your brain to solve problems in a complex manner, and it's this process of challenging your brain that is able to improve the ability of your brain to be able to improve your information retention. So you can engage in that. The third step is that you need to manage your stress. By engaging in activities that improve the way you deal or handle with stress, such as yoga, meditation, and mindfulness, those can be able to reduce your stress so that you reduce the ability of your brain to produce this harmful chemical called cortisol. Now, cortisol is a chemical that's produced every time you're stressed that can inhibit your ability of your brain to retain information. The more you relieve yourself of stress and remove yourself from stressful situations, the more likely you are to be able to be more efficient in boosting your memory. Hopefully, guys, this video has been helpful in order for you to be able to understand some of the tricks and tips to be able to improve your memory. Let's chat in the comment section. Let's see if any of these activities can start being of assistance to you today in order to improve your memory. Until we meet again, remember that I believe in you. You can do it. Ensure that you learn smart and not necessarily hard, and utilize your mind to the best of your abilities. Thanks.